Yeah, here we go.
Thank you. Well, hi and welcome everybody. I'm Kate Odell and I'm this year's president of the Friends of the Library and also a member of the Blue Hill Garden Club. So I'm really happy to be able to introduce you to this series that we're having for the month of April of innovative gardens on the Blue Hill Peninsula. Lots of great ideas of what to do this year in your own garden and opportunities to volunteer. Tonight, we're going to hear about the native gardens of Blue Hill. And then next week, we're going to hear about a regenerative no-till soil management that's coming to Clayfield Farm that's in East Blue Hill. Then the Garden Club is going to talk about the community garden that's on Tenney Hill and the Heritage Apple Tree Preservation Program that Five Star Nursery in Brooklyn is helping with is going to be the fourth week. So it should be really great. I want to thank the speakers for coming tonight and all of the audience, and also really thank the library staff for helping with this. That's Hannah doing the technical work behind that mask. If you have questions tonight, please write them in the chat and we will bring them up at the end of the program. And then, as you know, it's being recorded, so you can get a copy of it if you want. So I'm going to turn the program over then to our speakers tonight, Avi Clare and Kathy Reese, who are both, we're so happy to have them working on the peninsula. They're horticulturalists, educators, and garden designers who brought us this amazing native plant garden of Blue Hill.
Thanks, Kate. I'm Avi, and I'm going to start the evening off with a little talk about well, like the more native garden talks we seem to give, the more we seem to focus on the message of stewardship. You know, gardening is a lot about stewardship. And we feel it's really important to understand nature and how it works, because nature really knows what to do. And we tend to intervene, and sometimes that intervention doesn't always lead to the best like unintentional consequences sometimes. So we want to help you as gardeners and new gardeners, potential gardeners, understand how much nature can take care of itself. And as gardeners, we're shaping and tidying up our landscapes to make them beautiful for us to enjoy. And that includes us enjoying the birds that come and eat the berries and the seed heads, the insects that come and drink the nectar, and even the caterpillars that will eat some of the leaves. So our first slide is kind of a little bit of the, I don't know, this is a little bit of the bad news first. There are a few different models out there that talk about how much of the Earth's surface we've altered. And if you think about it, there's the human settlement, there's the agriculture, the infrastructures like all the transportation, the roads, the bridges, the power lines, the railroads. And I've read that agriculture alone can impacts about 70% of the Earth's land surface and 2/3 of the marine environment. Basically, all this leads to habitat loss. It leads to erosion, it contributes to climate change, and it also leads to the loss of diversity in our ecosystem. So the best we can do as gardeners is to work on our small pockets of land and provide valuable habitat for the native plants and animals, and they will help balance things out.
So I'm Kathy. Nice to not see everybody. Anyway, so basically, if we're talking about native plants, basically we look at the whole country and we see that Maine is the most forested state in the nation. So we have the biggest, best forests anywhere. So that all sounds like that's really great news. However, let's go to the next slide. In a study done by the Nature Conservancy, where they looked at all the roads that crisscross our state in every direction, and then subtracted the width of the road plus 1,000 meters on either side, you can see that very little unimpacted forest remains in our state. So even though we have these wonderful forests, they are still heavily impacted by our transportation alone. And then I just wanted to add, before we get too far, that Maine is mostly a forest, but we do have some openings, and those openings are mostly mountaintops and bald, ledgy areas, and also the wetlands. So we have very large wet meadows, both in freshwater and the saltwater. So that is kind of the habitats that naturally exist in Maine, and that's where the plants are that we can use in our gardens. And also, when you think about it, we need to be helping with the species richness and diversity of the forests, because we are really impacting them so severely.
So here's a map of the United States, and it's showing the ecoregions. And you can see Maine on the top right corner. And basically we're in an area that's called the Laurentian mixed forest. And you can see on the map other parts of the country up in Wisconsin and Michigan and Minnesota, and even in Pennsylvania, the north part of Pennsylvania and New York State. And the rest of New England is similar. That these are the places where the plants that are best suited for our ecosystem are, this is the region that supports the plants that we should be looking at. Just so you realize that the rest of the country have different conditions. There's the plants that develop there have different genetic signals, and getting a plant from another part of the country doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be genetically appropriate for our region.
So the question is, what can we do as gardeners to help this situation? So of course, our answer is plant more native plants. And also when you're thinking about that, plant for diversity. Because our forests and our land has been so impacted, diversity has really diminished throughout the state and throughout our entire country. And in the most recent publication, The Plants of Acadia National Park, they found there were like 200 plants that seem to have disappeared even in the last 30 years. They were unable to find 30 species of plants. So it's still happening. It's, even though we live in a place we feel is so pristine, it is really diminished from what it could be. So our definition of native plants are plants that got to where they are without any human intervention, and of course have evolved along with the other plants, animals, fungi, bacteria in those areas to be what they are today. Okay. So the evolution of plants and their environment is really what makes everything what it is today. So plants are really the engines that run the world, basically, and everybody else is going to benefit from their ability to turn sunlight into energy. So we have caterpillars munching on foliage, and as gardeners, we have to learn to be tolerant of that. That one in the upper middle photograph, that's that Abbott sphinx moth larva, which lives primarily on grape and also on Virginia creeper. And I've had the privilege to see this little critter a couple of times. And even though that sphinx moth is in the same group as the tomato hornworm, the sphinx moth has the courtesy to lay just 1 or 2 eggs, not a whole bunch on all of your crops. So I feel like we need to develop a tolerance for the other animals that are feeding on the plants, because they are really the base of the food chain. So here we have the Bohemian waxwing. He's eating the red elderberries and the Luna moth on the lower left. Funny thing, that moth does not even feed as an adult. It does all its feeding as a larva. So we have all these wonderful plants around us producing a lot of different kinds of foods for different kinds of animals, and they've all evolved together, and we need to keep that system intact.
So here's part of the system, the soil food web, and you can see that the plants are really the engines in our Earth system, and they photosynthesize and create all this energy, which is then converted from the sunlight into another form of organism that other forms of organisms can use. And you can see on this drawing that everything feeds. The roots are shedding organic matter, and there are microbes that are feeding off of that, and bacteria and fungi and nematodes are eating that. And, she's going up and up in the food chain. And there's this whole alive system underground that we don't know a lot about, but we have to learn to take care of it. And at the very end of that food chain are mammals, and we're a part of that. So we need to respect the plants, because they're feeding everything, including us.
So if we take a little bit closer view on the plant's relationship with the soil and the organisms in there. So because the plant is up above ground photosynthesizing, it's bringing sugars down through its roots and rootlets and feeding the microorganisms in the soil. Those would be the fungi and bacteria that live there. The ones that are feeding off of the plant are also protecting it from other fungus and bacteria that might want to harm the plant. And also they are releasing different compounds that are making the nutrients in the soil available to the plant. So it's both a give and a take situation with the soil microbiome. So the plant is helping the organisms in the soil, and they are in turn helping the plant. So it's important to keep that going.
So here's one of the ways to take care of the soil is to think about what we're putting back into it. And there's so many materials that are available, just part of the ecosystem already, that we can collect and add back into the, and create and enrich the soils around us. This is a slide of the teaching garden at the Native Garden, and it's a place where the soil is extremely poor. It used to be a parking area, so very gravel, had been compacted quite a bit. And we're actually building soil with these natural materials. And on the lower left is a slide view of a plant called sweet fern. That plant will fix nitrogen. It's one of the soil builders. It has a lot of leaf litter that can help bring organic matter into the ground as well. So we don't need to have a lot of inputs. Native plants actually don't like a lot of fertilizer. So the best we can do is really try to understand the soil and feed the soil with the natural ingredients, and the plants will be the happiest.
And one thing to not do is to try to avoid compacting the soil whenever possible. So if you look at that little pie chart in the lower left, you can see that soil is mostly, well, 25% air and 25% water. So what happens when you drive a heavy vehicle over an area, especially when it's wet, you'll see that tire print there. Well, that has squished down and pushed the air and water out of that part of the soil. And the air and water are required by the roots of the plant, required by the soil microorganisms. So you basically kind of killed everything below ground where you drove the tractor through. So you have to be especially conscious of driving or, even walking in the same route all the time, and especially in wet conditions, can do a lot of harm. The second thing is tilling. We have this habit of tilling our soil. We think it's good, but basically you're disrupting the entire colony that is living below the soil every time you till. So trying to find no-till methods is going to be the most beneficial for the soil organisms, and as a result, the plants as well.
So just to continue with the soil stories, when you compact soil, it cannot absorb any more water. So that can lead to a lot of shedding and down the road erosion. Unplanted soils also lead to erosion. And you can see in the picture on the right that driveway parking area in front of that unplanted area, the water sheds really fast off the driveway and goes right into that soil that doesn't have any roots holding things together. And there's the situation, you can see it eroding. The compacted soil on the left is pretty much as hard as that hardtop driveway because it just can't absorb anymore. So we have to really imagine how, what we're doing to the ground. If it's a piece of land that's where there's construction and there's equipment going back and forth, and especially it rains, the ground is wet, just that soil has been compacted quite a bit.
Okay, so the most important thing in trying to figure out how to plan your garden for native plants is basically understanding your site and thinking about what kind of conditions you have and then what kinds of plants would be appropriate to grow in those conditions. So since we've been talking about soil, we'll start with soil depth. So on the left, we have shallow soils, and those would be, on or surrounding a lot of exposed ledge that we have here on the coast. And then to the right, we have a deeper soil. We'd find those typically in a meadow or a forest. So the three-leaf cinquefoil on the left, that's a plant that's commonly found on top of a Cadillac mountain. And we can also find it on the roadsides. It is quite salt tolerant and will live in the gravel too. And then the plant on the right, the black elderberry, that has a taproot, and that goes very, very deep into the ground. So it really requires a deeper soil than the plant on the left.
So another aspect of soil can be how rich it is or how lean it is. Lean meaning probably that it drains really fast. It's pretty gravelly. It doesn't have a lot of organic matter in it. And there are plants that are naturally found in those areas. This one on the left, bearberry, is something that you often see on ledges. It really likes the hot, drier conditions. If it's on a slope, it can take a little bit more moisture because it will drain faster on a slope. It doesn't really like water. So if you are using it, just be aware of that. It's not going to be happy in the shade, as happy in the shade. It won't be very happy if it's in wet soils. And on the other side of the spectrum, if you're one of the people lucky enough to have a hobble bush on your land, that's quite a beautiful understory shrub, one of the viburnums. And it loves that rich humusy soil found in the woods, and it likes light shade. It does quite well in a woodland setting, usually in a high canopy. If it has too much shade, you might not get that beautiful floral show that you're seeing in this photograph.
Okay, so soil pH is another condition. Right here on the coast, we typically have a very acidic soil, and that's because of the granite bedrock that is underneath us all, and the other bedrock like the Ellsworth schist and things are very acidic. So we typically have the hay-scented fern, which you can see there on the left. It thrives in our typically acidic soils. You can grow the maidenhair fern on the right, but you need to amend the soil a bit to make it super happy. So what I like to do is just add those decorative marble chips. I actually bury them in the ground around the root ball of the plant when I'm planting it. And because they're lined, they're going to be making the soil a little bit more basic as a kind of slow release. As the microorganisms work on those marble chips, the pH is going to be going, it's going to be going up around the maidenhair fern. So we can have both. We just have to take that into consideration.
It's good to get to know your soils, and watching year round is one of the good, observation is going to be key. So watching how things are year round is going to be important, because there are a lot of soils that are flooded in the winter that might seem very, very dry in the summer. So that's going to make a difference with what plants you can use. On the left, the Rhodora which naturally grows in a lot of the wetlands and marshes, can also take it when it's drier. So they can be in a soil that's seasonally wet, if that's what you have on your land. And you can see that the juniper on the right you can see the rock and the sense of the slope and the high ground. So it's a really dry situation there. And again, it's another plant like the bayberry that is happier when it's not wet.
Okay, and then the last thing that you need to be aware of is the light conditions on your site. And in this case, we're showing the same plant on the left and on the right. So on the left, the roundleaf dogwood is under a cedar canopy, and you can see how open the plant is. You can kind of see right through it. You can see those red colored stems, which are really beautiful. And the plant on the right, however, is grown in the open. So it's not that this plant requires sun or requires shade. It can survive in either condition. It's just going to look different. So if you want a full plant, you're going to have to plant it in a sunnier situation rather than the shade. So understanding how to use plants and whether you should put them on the edge of the woods or deep in the woods or out in the open is going to affect their both how well they thrive and how well you the shape of them.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about choosing the plants that would work best for you and some of your conditions. This plant is related to the dogwood we just saw. It's the only dogwood that has alternative branching structure, which is why it's known as the alternate leaf dogwood. It's also known as the pagoda tree, which it has a beautiful form that kind of grows in tiers like a pagoda. And we're showing different stages of this plant in different parts of the season to show. On the top left there, it has the early summer blooms, and that's obvious pollinator food. The berries are later in the season and more food for wildlife. And there's a picture on the right just showing it in a dappled light situation. This is a fairly young shrub, so it's but you can get a little sense of its tiering structure.
Okay, so thinking about what things are going to look like beyond the summer. Well, on the left, we have the striped maple, which of course is at its glory at this moment. The photo is taken with the pendulous racemes of flowers that are just like glowing in the early summer light. But this plant also has wonderful green and white striped bark, and it can really light up a shady area. This is a plant that doesn't really care to be in the full sun, would prefer a little canopy overhead. And then to the right, our favorite, the winterberry, which its flowers are not that noticeable, but we really grow it for the winter, the berries in winter, and we can enjoy them for quite a while until they become food for a ravenous flock of cedar waxwings or crossbills or something like that.
So sometimes we need a plant or shrub that will help us screen an area. And one of our favorites, especially since there's often a lot of shade on the land that we're working, is the corylus. There are two, the American hazelnut and then the beaked hazelnut, which are these pictures here, the details showing. That picture on the bottom of catkins was actually just taken. Kathy just took that today. And so that's blooming right now. It's pollinator food in the early part of the season, also quite important. And the nuts on the top left are often gobbled up by critters long before we ever get a chance to harvest them. So you can see it has a lot of value for the wildlife, and it also can offer us a nice screen if we're looking to have that in one of our areas on our landscape.
Okay. And then we kind of alluded to this earlier, using plants for soil building and nitrogen fixing. So again, the sweet fern on the left, and then on the right, this is a photo at the Native Garden. We decided to plant speckled alder as a specimen tree right in front of the library. It's still pretty small in this photo, and it's surrounded by bayberry. But both the alder and the bayberry are also nitrogen fixers, and they are going to be improving the soil over time at the library. This was a construction site when we got there, and the soils there really not much to write home about. So we're trying to build up the organic layer by leaving the leaf litter where it falls. Other plants would be the legumes that we know to be good nitrogen fixers. And we don't have a lot of native legumes in Maine, and the one that is so beautiful, the sundial lupin, which was native to Maine, has now actually been extirpated from the state. But we can still get seed for it, and we can still plant it in our garden, and it will fix nitrogen. It's also the host to a lot of butterflies, and it's much more sweet and dainty than the lupin that we have growing in the fields all around, which is native to North America, but at the West Coast.
So plants can help us alleviate some problems in our landscapes, like erosion, and it can help prevent erosion. And there are plants that can work in wetter soils where that erosion might be occurring, because the erosion is occurring, those soils are often wet. So sedges are a whole group of grass-like plants that are really adaptable to our land, and functional in our landscapes for these reasons. And they have, obviously you can see in these pictures, they have lovely seed heads, and they can offer a lot of variety in their display that pop up throughout the season. So that they're a really good group of plants to be looking at as a kind of a ground cover, as part of a matrix that can hold the soils, especially when we're thinking about green mulches versus using those, bark mulches that will obviously move when the water hits it and make a big mess downstream. So, and then on the right is the button bush, which is one of our favorites. And you can, oh, I forgot to put the detail of flower in. Oops. That flower, okay, well, look it up, because that flower is like a little plant from outer space. And it's this globe that has, the stamens and just flying all around. So it's a really fun plant. It can stand in water. It can be like almost basically in a pond. So it can really be useful. It's this spot, it's not that wet right there, or it might get wet a little bit in the spring, but it doesn't stay wet all summer. And you can see it's thriving with New England aster in the front and some blueberry off to the right, lower right. And in that wonderful woodland setting, it still gets enough light to bloom.
Okay, so another way to just incorporate more natives is to use them as ground covers or underplanting to what you already have going on in the garden. So here on the left, obviously the hosta and the Rogersea and Astilbe are not native, but the ground is basically covered with the two plants on the right. So the one on the upper right is the twin flower. This is just the sweetest possible little plant that I just love. And those little flowers, even though one particular flower or a pair of flowers might not last that long, the plant does bloom for quite a long time. And then the lower right, this is the foam flower. And this makes a great ground cover. This kind of a lighter green color leaf really contrasts with all the deeper greens of, say, those hostas there. We've noticed that there are often a couple of different genotypes, I guess, of this foam flower out there. A lot of the named varieties form clumps, although a couple of them are called like a running tapestry or something like that. So they will be more of the spreading type. I think the only time I saw this giant, basically natural ground cover of it was the running type. And it was just the most fabulous site. It was like solid, 100% under a black tupelo tree. And that was like a special day for me to have found that.
So if we're thinking about layering, the higher canopy trees are basically an essential habitat. And they're also giving the plants below that dappled light. The plants those woodland plants want that dappled light. So it's good to think about those layers when you're working at building a garden or augmenting your garden. And of course, they're habitat for so many creatures. And I know that we've said this many times, but oaks are really the host to the biggest wonderful tree. And we're lucky at the Native Garden to have a high canopy of oaks there. And that was one of the things that attracted us to that site. And they are just a special tree in our environment. They're hosting over 500 species of moths and butterflies. And of course, the birds are relying on those caterpillars for their food.
So again, thinking about the layering on a larger scale, it's good to think about planting trees under the higher canopy. And we talked about the striped maple earlier. That's a great one. And this here, the, which we have the striped maple label on this one. Oops, this is the,
this is the last minute fix.
This is a witch hazel here. So on the right, sort of gives you the form. It has more of like an open form. Again, it's in a little bit of a sun here on the slide. In the deeper shade, it's going to have fewer stems. They're going to be a little bit more open. You're going to be able to see through the plant. And the nice thing then is when it does bloom, you're going to have this like mist of yellow flowers in November that you can just like see through. It'll be like a cloud of yellow. Anyway, some other wonderful trees that love to be in the understory are our favorite shadbush, which is going to be like the first thing to bloom really soon now. The blue beech and the striped maple that we mentioned earlier.
Okay, so I guess to sum things up, we've been talking a lot about the different kinds of soils and light conditions, and then there's that time to things to consider when you're designing your garden, to putting things together, and the different root structures. Like we talked about, the elderberry has a big tap root, and then there are other fibrous rooted plants that could live very comfortably alongside of those. And in terms of growth habit, when you're looking at a garden, it's nice to have things above and things below. So if you have a tree or a vase-shaped shrub, then you can have other forms like rounded forms underneath that. Different bloom times and foliage color, that's going to take you through the season. And to stress that foliage doesn't have to be like strong colors like those cultivars or those, designed plants that you often see in some of the nurseries. There's pale green and gray green and limey greens and deep forest greens and textures that all kind of work together and provide a full spectrum of tones and shapes throughout the season. And I think that we have, hopefully we've shown you a few options for solving some problems in your landscape or things that you're trying to accomplish.
So we'll talk about a couple of easy things. That you can do. One is just to groom the forest edge. So here, a lot of these ferns might have been planted, but now they're just left to their own devices, and presents a nice, neat edge. We do have the Mayflower here as well, which is not native, but it mixes quite well with the native plants here. So it's really just like picking up sticks and pruning out the extra spruce trees that you don't want, and just grooming and managing what you have.
And here's a entry garden at a house where most of the plants here are actually not native. They're garden favorites, and peonies and lady's mantle, daylilies. But you can add native plants. Here are in the front here are ostrich ferns, and there's a little bit of hay-scented fern right in this edge over here. So it's just an opportunity to just put a few natives into an already existing bed.
And another thing you can do is learn to appreciate moss as the green that stays green all year round, unlike our lawns. And if there is a place in your lawn that is kind of getting overtaken by moss, maybe let it take over. Let the moss take over by weeding out everything else, and then you can have a nice solid green area. So on the right, this area was cultivated to be kept free of other things so that the moss could be appreciated there. And moss is actually very easy to transplant too, so that's another thing you can do, move it from elsewhere on your property to get a larger, more consistent area of moss.
So here's a issue that we're all facing, and it's hard to know what to do because the deer are part of the ecosystem too, but they're really overwhelming us right now. And they are actually a threat to a lot of the diversity in our forest. And you can see in this photograph that on the top left, that deer nibbled that lady slipper and took away the bloom from it. So it's not going to be very happy. It's not going to offer anything this season. And I don't even know if it will damage it enough to, just eliminate it or keep it from propagating. So we have a lot of problem with deer browsing in our woods. And if there's, that's just another issue that we're facing, and I don't really have an answer for it, but it is something to be aware of.
Well, one thing you can do is if you have some lady slippers or something like that, it's not very attractive, but you can fence them off for the deer to prevent the deer from doing that, which I'm contemplating because that was my lady slipper that was missing its head. Anyway, and they don't come up every year, so they're putting a lot of energy into making that flower, and then to have the deer just take it away in one bite is a little bit annoying. Anyway, so how to get some plants. So one thing we love to say is really celebrate what you already have. Everybody has native plants on their property, and you just need to start appreciating them more. So you can start treating your wild plants just like garden plants, and you can prune them, groom them, move them to a better spot, or maybe you just want to get rid of them. So we call this editing, when you just look at the wild area and you just add your touch to what's going on there by maybe eliminating some of the extra things. We humans, we like to see things in their own spaces, and nature sometimes doesn't cooperate that well. So by just managing what's there, you can make a wild area look like it's tended and part of the garden. Okay, so the other thing you can do is just to transplant or divide plants from elsewhere on your property. And I know we've been talking a lot about the site conditions and things like that, but it's also okay to push the boundaries. You can try to transplant something from the forest and bring it out to the edge or bring it out into the garden, see how it does. It's great. You will learn a lot, and the plant, you'll be able to tell if it's surviving or not. So anyway, dividing, transplanting, those are great ways to get more plants. And so then also collecting seed from your friends or from nearby. Of course, like Avi mentioned before, the genetic diversity is such that plants closer to home are going to be more beneficial to the organisms in your yard than seeds that you get from mail order someplace else. So collect seeds, sow them in pots in the autumn, and leave them out over the winter to germinate in the spring. I'm anxiously awaiting the germination of a lot of seeds in pots this year. And then the last thing, to purchase local, sustainably grown plants. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that in the next slide.
Here we go. So these are the names of local nurseries that are doing things, growing things sustainably. And 3 of these nurseries are going to be at our Native Garden plant sale, which we've decided will be May 29th, Saturday. We'll probably do some COVID protocol again this year, meaning we will announce the plant sale with links to plant lists that each nursery will have, so you could pre-order to pick up that day. Fernwood Nursery and Blue Aster Nursery are both outside of Belfast. They're not going to be participating in our sale, but they're very good nurseries to know about. And all of the Rebel Hill and 5 Star and Honey Petal Nursery all have, well, Rebel Hill doesn't have a website. No, they all have websites.
Oh, they do.
So you can look it up. Yeah, they just started a website. So you can be in touch with them directly too. You don't have to wait for our plant sale. You can go visit them and pick out plants and all year long. So all summer long. So, but we bring you this plant sale every year because one of the missions at the Native Garden is to promote these local nurseries. We want to introduce more sustainably grown native plants into the market. And that's a really big, important part of our work. And this comes to the end of the slideshow. So I know we're going to be looking for some questions, but here's, just so you know, this is a picture of the front area in front of the library. This was all construction soil, and that we added just a thin layer of soil to and planted seeds and small plugs and transplanted into this space. I think this picture was taken 2 years after we planted this garden. So you can see how you can get something quite beautiful. We're open all year round. We have trails. We have a couple, we have one handicap access trail that we've completed, and we have volunteers that come. We have a volunteer/mentor day every other Friday. We'll be announcing that. So we do rely on volunteers. We're an all volunteer organization, and we've been really fortunate to have such a dedicated group of volunteers helping us over the last few years and being in a place that really has supported us. So we really thank everyone for all of your support.
Yes, absolutely.
And I guess we're ready for questions.
There are a couple questions already. One is if you have any suggestions about leach fields, what kind of native plants might like to grow on a leach field, especially if there's a slope. Doesn't say sunny or shady, but
Hay-scented fern has been a very easy one to spread. It spreads pretty rapidly. It's kind of an aggressive plant. We don't want to put it usually in a garden, but if you can get some hay-scented fern on it, I mean, you can seed it also with native grasses, but the hay-scented fern will really is something that can really take off and thrives on it.
And sweet
and
fern
also,
is
again, a lot of native grasses. Mm-hmm.
Sweet fern is another good one. Usually the leach field is in sun because it's, but you can't have shrubs and trees growing on there. So any of the, wet meadow species or any of the ones you see in the photo here would work on a leach field if you wanted to make it more colorful than, a solid green. Yeah, I think it's a fallacy. I don't think you have to have grass on it. I think my leach field doesn't have any grasses on it. It's full of plants. So.
How about lawns? There's also a question about lawns. Are there any kind of things that are great to include, or, do you know anything about mowing in an insect-friendly way?
Not mowing, picking out little paths in your lawn. I don't know how much you need a lawn, if it's just a visual expanse that is pleasing, or if you want to play badminton, that's a whole different story. But you can just choose areas that you want to be mowed, and that can include just paths going through it, and not mowing until early spring, because there's so many critters that are living in the stems and the all year round. I mean, especially in the winter, they're nesting there.
Yeah, and I think just not mowing is really a good alternative if you can stand that. It will really increase the diversity. The thing is, when you mow something all the time, basically you're going to get non-native grasses to thrive there, because the grasses that came from Europe are much better adapted to grazing. And so mowing weekly is sort of like grazing. So unfortunately, our native grasses are not as well adapted to that situation, because they didn't evolve with cattle and other grazing animals. So anyway, I would just try to mow less. You'll get more natives to come in, or even just stop mowing the edges, and then natives will start occupying those areas once you stop mowing.
So what about, like if sorrel has kind of taken over the lawn, or somebody asks, if you wanted to get rid of your lawn altogether, are we back to the sweet fern and native, hay-scented fern?
Well, you don't, I mean, if you stop mowing, you'll be surprised how many native flowering things will move in, and depending on the soil and the light, that's going to kind of encourage certain things over other things. I mean, that's one very low energy, it's a very passive way of creating something. You don't have to do much to it. But there are ground covers, wild strawberries, and sweet fern and hay-scented can really rapidly fill an area. So I'm just trying to think of how to.
Looks like there are a lot of people trying to.
My biggest suggestion is just stop mowing. Sorry?
Looks like there are a lot of people trying to get rid of their lawn.
Stop mowing is the best way. And then you don't have to mow it even once a year. You can mow it once every 2 years. The only reason you're mowing it is probably to keep the woodies from taking over. And it does help trimming things back, and kind of sometimes can encourage root growth as well. So it's good to do that in the fall, late in the fall, when a lot of the insects have gone dormant or have died for the year and left their eggs for next year. So if you're really thinking about the insect population, just mow as late as possible if you do need to mow. And you might also consider just mowing a portion of the lawn this year and leaving half of it for next year, and then mowing that half next year and leaving the other half. So you don't take away all the food and habitat all at once.
Do you happen to know whether there's anything good about brown-tailed moths? When someone asks, they're not good for humans, but are they food for, is the larva food for birds or anything?
Oh, yeah. Yes, it's food for birds.
So when you're all itchy, you should be thinking, wow, this is so wonderful for the birds. You have a website, right? There it is. I see it. Native Maine Gardens. Somebody wanted to know how to find out about your plant sale.
The website, nativemainegardens.org, right there on the slide. Yeah. And if you can sign up for our newsletter. So when you go to the site, there'll be a little thing that, a link to sign up for our newsletter. And we periodically send out information, and we'll definitely be sending out information about that when we know more.
And do you happen to know of any plants that are tick deterrents?
Oh, well, maybe it's in the.
I know
mountain mint, I don't know. I wonder mountain mint might, or.
I don't know. All I know is that barberry. If you need another reason to hate it, it's supposed to be attractive for ticks. But that might just be because a lot of times the deer have eaten everything, and the only thing left in a forest that's been invaded with barberry is barberry. But anyway, now I don't know, but the tick tubes, I feel like the tick tubes work really well. Oh, you could try, I guess, the chrysanthemums because they have the pyrethrum in it. But the tick tubes have that pyrethrum in the cotton balls, and the mice come and take the cotton balls to their nests, and then that kills the ticks on the mice, and then that stops the life cycle of the ticks right there. So I feel like, I use them around my house because I don't want ticks, and I feel like it's been effective. Avi, what do you think in your experience?
They've been, we use them too. So
it's not a quick
that's
fix.
A good idea. No,
it's not a quick fix though, because it takes 2 years to impact the life cycle. So you really have to, once you start it, just keep doing it, putting them out twice a season, and then hopefully you'll start to see some results.
Yeah.
You mentioned mountain mitten. There is a question about how aggressive it is and whether it's controllable or whether it's a good plant to grow.
Mountain mint is not that aggressive. I don't think of it as aggressive.
Well, in the sun, it's definitely more aggressive than if it were in shadier conditions.
But it's not like an uncontrollable aggressiveness the way some plants can be, Right.
But it is a mint.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Someone says that they used to have a beautiful lawn. Now it's all moss and dandelions. And they're wondering how a native would get in if to this impregnable moss.
Well, ferns and moss cohabitate very well together. Sounds like it might be shady if there's a lot of moss there. So I think you should start thinking about like a woodland garden instead of a lawn. The dandelions are telling you that the soil is lean. There aren't a lot of nutrients on the surface. So you might think about adding a lot of organic matter. The dandelion has the taproot, so it's getting its nutrients from very deep in the soil, but it can actually be useful because it does bring them up to the surface, and then when it dies, it leaves the nutrients at the surface of the soil. So I would go on a program of adding compost, or not compost, but like leaf litter and mulch, and trying to improve the organic matter in the area, and then try to add in some woodland plants like ferns particularly. And then once those get going, you can try some of the more delicate woodland species.
And someone says to eat the dandelions.
Yeah.
Great. So I think here's another. So woodland plants and ferns. If someone is just summarizing, if you're getting rid of your lawn and then woodland plants and ferns are the way to go.
Well, if it's shady and you have a moss problem, it's sort of telling you it's shady and moist. So.
Great. Thanks. So I don't see any other questions. Waiting 1 second. And it happens to be 8 o'clock. So that is great. So many people said, thank you so much. They learned so much from the presentation. So that is great. And thank you everyone for coming, and make sure and let people know. Hannah's going to send out to everybody who was a participant tonight the link to the YouTube, and you can pass that on to your friends and come and visit the Native Gardens of Blue Hill, and also volunteer and look at their website and see what's going on. So thank you. Next week, we're going to hear about no-till regenerative agriculture. So please come back for that. And good night.
Thank you, Kate and Hannah and everyone who showed up tonight.
Yes. Great. Yeah, thank you. We just love to talk about plants. So
yeah, you do it so well.
Great. Well, I'll end the recording here.